Robert, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Toby. It's great to be here, especially so early in the morning. It's always intimidating to be the first speaker at a conference. So the paper that I'll be talking about today came out of some work I did on a task force convened by Larry Diamond, Ned Foley, and a few other American political scientists and law professors that was on the topic of political extremism. What might electoral reforms do to mitigate political extremism in the United States? As my time on this task force proceeded, I noted that there was a substantial disagreement between those who wanted to develop empirically well-grounded, well-tested recommendations about reforms that might yield some consequences over the upcoming 10, 20, 30 years in the United States, and efforts to prevent what people saw as the most harmful things that Donald Trump might do were he to be reelected in 2024. Which side people fell on largely depended on how bad they thought things were, how desperate Americans ought to be for short-term fixes, as opposed to how much we ought to invest in longer-term ideas. There really isn't, to my knowledge, an adequate theory about this, about how to balance short-term and long-term consequences of electoral reforms. And so I've tried to lay out some principles here. I wouldn't necessarily call them theories, but different camps of thinking about this subject in the United States. And I'm hopeful that these can serve as ways to generalize this, to think about whether these are principles that will apply to other countries. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to lay out 4 different perspectives. I will walk you through how these might be applied to a couple of different topics in the United States, and to explore some of the contrast between short-term and long-term thinking. The first of these topics comes from the work of Bruce Kane. Bruce Kane, in a book published in 2014, laid out his theory of what he called reform populism. That is, Kane is of the opinion that most political reforms are anti-system in nature. If they are going to appeal to the public, they necessarily will be efforts to reduce the power of political parties, political institutions. And what Kane sees as the problem here is that if you're going to enact reforms in a democratic system, you have to do 2 things. You have to overpromise to your allies. That is, the people who are going to be working on your side have to be of the opinion that this is going to be a consequential change. They're expending effort to do this. And at the same time, you have to reassure your potential opponents that the change is not going to be too dramatic, that it's not going to radically disrupt the status quo, that the effect of the change you're proposing is not necessarily an enduring shift in partisan power. And Kane's argument is that ultimately this creates what he calls reform cycles, that when reforms are implemented, they don't necessarily live up to the promises of their proponents, that they may take years to be implemented, but the people who put all this work in expect results immediately. So inadequate reforms will either radicalize their proponents, that is, they will lead people to call for much more dramatic changes, or they will demoralize them. They'll look and they'll say, well, nothing changed, I wasted my time. A second broad sort of theory comes from the work of Larry Jacobs in his book, Democracy Under Fire, a study of the direct primary in the United States. Jacobs draws on the work of E.E. Schattschneider to argue that reform is almost always a tool for those on the outside as an effort to expand the conflict. And when one does so, the consequences become unpredictable. And reforms also tend to be, what he says, they tend to be contingent or sticky. That is, there will be short-term results, a fluky election result, something goes wrong with a potential reform, and these things tend to stick around. Another point that Jacobs makes is that reformers often promise that what they are doing will be incremental, that we will try this reform. If it doesn't work out, that's okay. We can tweak it, we can reverse it, but then in practice, it is often very difficult to reverse reforms. A third perspective comes from the work of Suzanne Mettler, who has written on what is called the Policyscape. Drawing on the work of Theodore Lowy, she argues that reforms develop their own interests. Once a reform is implemented, different organizations develop that are based on maintenance of the status quo or on small tweaks to the reform to get it to work better. The problem, Mettler argues, is that in polarized political systems, like the American system, policy maintenance tends to be very difficult. That is, you don't necessarily foresee small problems with the reform that you've implemented, and it's necessary to legislate relatively minor reforms. But in a polarized system, such as the current American system, Congress cannot necessarily do this. Congress cannot engage in policy maintenance. This means that policy maintenance becomes the job of the executive branch, the courts, and the balance of power between the different branches is upset. And finally, a fourth piece that is more comparative in nature, coming from the work of Vivian Lowndes on institutional formation, argues that reformers often tend to focus on formal rules, but that what can matter in the case of a political reform is not necessarily the rules, but the narratives, these sort of informal conventions that develop around a policy. Lowndes argues that these narratives are often developed relatively independent of the reformers. They tend to involve questions like what the reform is about, why a particular institution exists, what the proper components of it are. And so reformers may win the battle to create formal rules, but lose the battle to define what those rules are about. So all four of these perspectives are not necessarily arguments against reform, but they seek to balance the risks. All of these perspectives acknowledge declining institutional capacity in the United States and other democracies, and they balance short-term and long-term consequences. So in my remaining time then, let me talk to you a little bit about two particular types of reform movements in the United States and what the short-term and long-term consequences of these are. Let me start by talking about the campaign finance reform movement in the United States. The most recent major set of campaign finance reforms that were legislated were what are called the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, which was passed in 2002 after approximately a decade of activism, mostly among Democrats, but to a smaller extent among Republicans, a movement led by the former Republican Senator John McCain. The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act had two major components, one of which was a reduction in the ability of political parties to raise unregulated political contributions. And along with that was a second effort to reduce the power of outside organizations to engage in what was then called independent advocacy. In selling this program to Democrats and Republicans, Democrats were led to believe that this would dramatically reduce the power of corporate interests, and Republicans were led to believe that it was in fact the Democrats who were the ones who were most likely to have used unregulated contributions, so Democrats would lose this opportunity at developing resources for the party. After the passage of this law, we had approximately 6 to 8 years of a basic use of this, that is a substantial reduction in outside spending. But there were other outlets that could be used, loopholes in the law that the Supreme Court gradually explored, that the parties gradually explored. American voters may have seen this somewhat. You could argue that the election of Barack Obama was partly due to this change in the campaign finance reform landscape, but the average voter did not necessarily notice. In 2010, with the passage of the Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court, a major component of this was done away with. So political parties were still restricted in what they could raise, but interest groups were given a new avenue for campaign spending. It was difficult for Congress to develop a legislative alternative to this, and by this time, the reform movement was largely exhausted. So how does this illustrate the four basic perspectives I've spoken about? To get to Bruce Kane's perspective, it's relatively clear. This was a movement that promised results, that promised those on the left that elections would be difficult, or would be different. When that didn't necessarily materialize, the movement largely disbanded. There is effectively no campaign finance reform movement in the United States today. To get to Larry Jacobs' story, these were incremental reforms. Many of the results were not necessarily visible to the average voter, but the different pieces of this, the limits on political parties in particular, stuck around so that we ultimately had this disruption of the political system in a way that nobody advocating this would have proposed, a dramatic expansion in the role of groups and a reduction in the role of political parties. To get to Mettler's story, again, the consequences are relatively clear. Congress could have acted to tweak this law, but in a divided system, Congress doesn't necessarily have the capacity to do this. And to get to the Lowndes story, it's clear that there were two competing narratives. There was a narrative that was presented to the public about the removal of big money from politics. At the same time, there was a second narrative that had been developing, which is really unique to the United States, that equated campaign spending with political speech. Ultimately, this narrative was triumphant despite the ideas of reformers. So short-term consequences, perhaps long-term consequences that nobody necessarily predicted from this law. And so we see today there's no real discussion about campaign finance reform. There's no effort to reconsider what the story ought to be in the United States. This is somewhat of a personal story. I began my academic career at an institute that studied campaign finance. I didn't fully grasp the consequences that reform might have for political parties or for the pluralist system in the United States. So I count myself among those who were somewhat disillusioned by what happened. I've spent the past few years consulting with organizations that advocate for primary election reform, who advocate for the establishment of ranked choice voting, which is something that's been implemented in the American states, particularly in Alaska. And I've spent a lot of time sort of being the curmudgeon, talking to them about how their grand ambitions for how this might reshape politics are not necessarily going to work. Some of the same problems are evident here. The most consequential effort in the United States to establish ranked choice voting took place 3 years ago now in the state of Alaska, which passed a reform creating an all-candidate primary from which 4 candidates would emerge and then would compete in a ranked choice general election. The idea here was relatively clear, that this would depolarize voters, would potentially aid moderates, or at least would incentivize candidates to reach out in the primary as well as the general election to voters who are not of their party, or to speak to people for whom they were not their first choice and say, you know what, I know you wouldn't normally vote for me, but would you consider making me your second choice or even your third choice? This succeeded in passing in Alaska, was implemented in the 2022 election. Alaska is, of course, a very unusual state, a state dominated by the Republican Party, but also a state whose politics revolve around resource extraction in a way that most American states do not. It was shaped by a contingent event, the victory of a Democrat, a Native woman in 2022, which normally would not have happened in Alaska, and the defeat of a much better known Republican candidate, the former vice presidential candidate, Sarah Palin. This wasn't necessarily an inevitable consequence of the electoral system, but the fact that it happened meant that many Democrats were quite excited about this, and many Republicans saw this reform as a Democratic plan. So the story here is that a reform effort in an unusual state wound up making this issue polarized. At the same time, the implementation of ranked choice voting in several American cities, most notably the city of New York, meant that voters saw this as a Democratic idea. And when New York had difficulty tabulating its ballots, voters drew the conclusion that this was something that was inevitable, that this would confuse voters. It was difficult to tweak the system in New York so that problems in vote counting wouldn't continue. So again, we can see this basic pattern. The short-term consequence of this election doesn't necessarily portend what the long-term consequences would be. The fact that Republicans by 2024 were able to use the system in Alaska to coordinate around a unified message to find a candidate who had broader appeal to moderates was lost on voters. They didn't necessarily notice this relatively predictable result, but they did notice the unpredictable results. In 2024, ranked choice voting was on the ballot in 6 American states, most of which were more typical states than Alaska, and it failed in all of them. To get to the Larry Jacobs story, again, we have a contingent event that shaped the narrative, that polarized people's attitudes. The Mettler story, again, the difficulty of engaging in maintenance, particularly in New York City, means that problems that emerge are not necessarily resolved. And the Lowndes story here, the narrative that developed after 2022 about who benefited and who lost persisted despite the fluky result here. So what do these things tell us? Well, clearly these tell us that if there are going to be reforms in any of these areas in the United States or elsewhere, we need to think about when the consequences might happen. If you're a cynic about where the United States is at right now in its politics, it's not necessarily clear that we Americans have the ability to engage in this conversation. That is, perhaps we ought to be focusing on the short term, focusing on the consequences of the Trump presidency, and not necessarily on reforms that would be manifest over decades. All reform efforts require resources. They require money. They require the time of the activists who are going to push for these things, and energy. That is, any effort at political reform means that people are focusing on one thing instead of the others. If you focus your resources on the wrong thing, you don't have them available at the time, and you may not have them available later for other projects that may yield more consequential results. However, despite my sort of grim story I've kind of alluded to about whether this is necessarily the right priority in the United States right now, it's easy to point to consequential reforms that take decades. During the previous times I've presented this work, people have said, well, think about women's suffrage. The women's suffrage movement in the United States took approximately 70 years, perhaps even longer. So we shouldn't necessarily discount the importance of reform efforts that might last beyond your and my lifetime. These things may be important. But at the same time, we can also point to reform efforts that take place remarkably fast. The progressive movement in the United States was over and done with within about 10 or 20 years. And there are those who would argue that the current attacks on the US electoral system being perpetrated by our government may yield results in a very short time frame, may make our elections unrecognizable by 2028, if not sooner. So again, the short-term versus the long-term story. I don't have an answer to this thing, but the paper is an exercise in trying to explain the trade-offs and trying to help us think about the time frame in which we're focusing on things, and to develop a cautionary tale that we can spend a lot of time developing models about how reforms might work. But if we lose track of the narrative, if we lose track of how the public interprets reforms, or if we lose track of the fact that we need to develop a compelling story about democracy, right? We can't just focus on political parties or elite institutions, but we need to develop a story to sell to the public about why reform exists and what it's about. Then we may wind up failing in the long run. We may establish a few components of reform that don't necessarily work, but set ourselves back by a few decades. So at a minimum, proponents of short-term and long-term change need to talk to each other instead of talking past each other, as I fear they often do.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you, Robert. That's brilliant. Thank you. Such an insightful paper from which I'm sure we all learned loads, really emphasizing the unexpected effects of electoral reforms and bringing into focus this temporal nature, the short-term and the long-term effects. So thank you so much for your intervention. Okay, so we move swiftly on to the second paper. This time we have Joris Gijsenbergh from the Electoral Council of the Netherlands. He's going to share with us his insights on the balance between robust, transparent and practical elections in the Netherlands. So Joris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Toby, and thanks for the invitation and especially the opportunity to share experiences with fellow experts on the challenges related to electoral reform and ways to mitigate them. I should point out right away that the challenge I will be talking about falls in the category others that you mentioned in your introduction. I will be mainly talking about the challenge how to keep everyone involved in the organization of elections, or election practitioners involved, and to create political consensus among stakeholders in the election process. And I will be doing that by discussing a Dutch case of a very recent reform, which was introduced 2 years ago. And that reform is the Dutch acronym is NPVV, so we'll be using that a lot. It stands for a new procedure for tabulating and declaring election results. 2 years ago, new rules were introduced. I will explain them at more length in a minute. And new rules were introduced to make to ensure that the election results are even more verifiable, even more transparent. However, that has put a strain on the relationship between the several stakeholders in the election process, as we will see. In order to, should be doing this, of course. I will briefly mention 4 points. First of all, I will just to briefly give you some context about the Netherlands. I will talk about our electoral management and the process of our electoral cycle in general, very briefly. Then I'll say something about how and why this reform 2 years ago was introduced. Then I'll talk about the consequences that we have seen in the last 4 elections in 2024 and 2025. Both the benefits and the disadvantages of the NPVV reform will be discussed. And then I would like to pose a few questions on how to proceed, because the disclaimer here, I won't be telling you how we should have done this reform, but how we have tackled it and what challenges have come across our path. So first off, the electoral management and electoral cycle in the Netherlands. We have a mixed model of electoral management, and it's very decentralized. So to begin with, the people who do the real work, those are in the municipalities. You see them on the right. The organization of election, from polling offices, of distributing ballots, but also of counting on a local level, is done by the municipalities. Then there is the Electoral Council, where I work. The Electoral Council itself consists of 7 people, as you can see here, and they are assisted by a staff of about 40 people, and I'm one of that staff. The Electoral Council, just a brief context on the electoral management in the Netherlands. It's a mixed model and decentralized. The brunt of the work of organizing elections is done by the municipalities. Organizing elections, but also tallying the votes on the municipal level. Then there is the Electoral Council on a national level. 7 members are in it, and they are assisted by 40 people. I'm one of that staff. The Electoral Council is, on the one hand, an advisory board to the Minister of the Interior, but on the other hand, also in national elections, we are the Central Electoral Committee. So we declare the final result. And then there's the Minister of the Interior. She is responsible for introducing electoral laws and is, of course, accountable to Parliament. In the Netherlands, like in many countries, we have an electoral cycle of reform. I won't have to introduce that concept here. What is important, though, is that we have an election agenda. That's a strategic agenda aimed at 2030, devised by all the stakeholders in the election process, so the municipalities, the Minister, and the Electoral Council. And it's a long list of possible reforms that we're planning, or at least considering, for the following years. And the main aim of this strategic agenda is to make Dutch elections, or to keep elections robust, accessible, and practicable, or feasible. The NPVV reform, introduced 2 years ago, is one of those reforms on the election agenda. and it shows that it's actually quite challenging to maintain the balance between the three safeguards on the election agenda. So robust elections, accessible elections, and feasible elections. Let me then turn to this case, this NPVV reform. Basically, 2 years ago, the reform was introduced, and it introduces 3 new rules for the procedure regarding the tabulation and declaration of election results. First of all, it allows municipalities to choose how they count votes on election day. On election day, votes are counted by volunteers. That's always the case. But municipalities can choose whether they have a short count only on party level, or an extensive count both on party level and on candidate level. It's important to realize that the Netherlands has an open list system of proportional representation. So people vote for a person, for a candidate who is part of a list of a party. So the first rule of the NPV is that municipalities can choose. Do they have a limited count on election day or an extensive count? The second rule introduced by NPVV was actually more important. It allows for a lot more checks, double checks, and recounts. After the count on the election day, the day after, the votes are counted by the municipality, combination of civil servants and volunteers again, and the municipal totals are tallied. What is introduced is that those counts can be recounted. And in the weeks after that, we at the Electoral Council also check and recheck and double check the tallies, and can order municipalities to do another recount. So basically, the second introduction of a second addition of the NPVV is to introduce a lot more double checks in the counting process. And the third one is that NPVV should make the entire process a lot more transparent. It makes it easier for voters to follow the entire voting and election process. So why was this introduced? Well, the direct cause was the immediate cause were some incidents in 2019 when in a few polling stations there were significant differences between the number of ballots counted and the number of voting passes, which is of course strange because those two numbers should be exactly the same. However, in a few polling stations there were vast or significant differences. That happened again in 2021, and that led to a measure that Parliament took, a measure Parliament could already take for over 100 years, since 1917, but had hardly ever used. Parliament ordered recounts in those polling stations. That led to the belief that actually recounts should be made easier and should not be dependent on a parliament that decides, but that a municipality already should be able to recount if there is any doubt. In addition to that, NPVV is part of an ongoing attempt to increase and maintain public trust in elections. Actually, in the Netherlands, we're quite satisfied with the high level of trust in elections. In 2021, 80% of the people in the Netherlands trusted the elections. However, there were also some worrying trends. It was a decrease compared to the years before. And we saw that youth and blue-collar workers were less trustworthy. So they had about 70% of them trusted the election. So that's the background of why the new rules in the new procedure was introduced in 2023. The question, of course, for this workshop is how was it introduced? What was the process involved? Well, what we often do in the Netherlands is when we introduce a law, we use an experiment law, introducing it only in a few municipalities at first to try and test it. That was only partly done with the NPVV. Only the first rule of the NPVV, so the choice between how to count on election day, was experimented with. The other rules to the increased transparency and the addition of double checks and recounts was not experimented with. That was actually not possible, because if we would have done so, then the process of tallying votes would have differed over the country, which would have been quite strange. However, that did lead to the fact that there were some false expectations and unintended consequences of the MPVV, because it meant that municipal election practitioners were mainly focused on that first rule, how to count on election day. Whereas actually what MPVV mostly does is introduce new rules for the 2 weeks after that. More transparency and more recounts. Municipal practitioners were not well prepared for that. And at the same time, the policy makers at the national level, both at the ministry and at the Electoral Council, I should admit, were not well prepared either, because they hadn't tested all facets of the MPVV. That led to both beneficial, well-intended goals. On the one hand, MPVV has met its goals. On the other hand, there were unintended negative sides, disadvantages. To briefly sum up the goals that were realized, so the benefits that were that we can see is, first of all, MPVV has increased the reliability of elections. It really has. We can see that the number of counting errors has decreased. Before 2023, it was hardly possible to order a recount. The Electoral Council, for example, could only do that if we were sure that a recount would lead to a different allocation in seats between parties. But now MPVV has made it a lot easier, and we can really see that a lot of counting errors are being located and corrected in a timely fashion. So that's a good thing.
Can I just give you a 1 minute warning or 1.5 minute warning, just on time, please?
I'll speed up. So the other goal that was realized is that MPVV really has increased the transparency. Voters can now follow the process a lot more. They can go to all polling stations. They can see all the reports of the polling stations posted on the website of the municipality. And if they think that something has gone wrong, they can report it to us at the Electoral Council, and we can then order a recount. So in that sense, MPVV has really done what it's supposed to do. At the same time, there were two challenges that we saw. First of all, MPVV has increased the burden of work, especially for municipalities, enormously, a lot more than was expected. Basically, to briefly sum up, before 2023, they had 2 days of work regarding the tallying of votes. Now it's about 2 weeks due to all the recounts. And that has put a strain on the relationship between the municipalities and us. And the second challenge is that it is not yet clear what the MPVV, what effect the MPVV has on the public trust. It should increase trust, because of more transparency. However, maybe this procedure is actually so complex that voters can't really follow it. Moreover, it's a procedure that is mostly known to election officers and not to the voters. So I have no answers here, but I'm very interested in hearing your input and how what that relationship might be. Very briefly to end. So how did we tackle those challenges? In 2 ways. First, we are continually evaluating elections. We always do that, but we are now also in the midst of an evaluation of this reform specifically, where we ask municipal practitioners, is it still workable? And if not, how would you reform it? And in addition, we have heavily invested to restore our relationships between municipal practitioners of elections and us at the national level. I'll end there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's a wonderful case study. And just for everyone who's in the audience who wants to find out more, obviously there'll be a chance to ask questions, but the paper is on the website, as they all are. and so you can see more information there. And just one thing that stood out there was just the value of experiments, pilots, and seeing what provides evidence, and that can really help inform rich discussions. So thank you very much. We now move to our third presentation, where we have Nikola Donev from the Faculty of Law, who's going to be talking about external influences on electoral reform. Nikola, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see my screen and can you hear me well?
Yep, all great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you everyone. I'll be following up hopefully with the great panel so far. My sort of topic that I dealt with is external influences on electoral reform, because there's, I think, a lot of discussion and a lot of rhetoric around malign sort of influences on elections recently, but I think it's also important to see how sort of external influences can affect or influence electoral reform. And in this context, I sort of define factors which influence electoral design and reform that are not directly related to the internal dynamics of the state, even though there is influence on that, but rather imposed by actors outside. So sort of a slight systematization, I would say, even though this is not perfect, and I don't pull this as a hard systematization. Sort of soft influences, we have the Venice Commission and the OSCE, and hard influences can be the European Court of Human Rights and potentially the European Union, with some caveats there. And of course, this is not, if you look at the institutions that we're analyzing, there are within the European context, the European regional context. So that is what I'm focusing on. And in this regard, soft influences would be those institutions that give sort of advisory opinions and whose work is developing norms and standards. And for hard influences are those that are more legally binding towards states, and or their political power is so great that that they can impose reforms upon states, which would be the case of the European Union when we get to that part of the paper. So the Venice Commission is probably is a very interesting body within the Council of Europe system, and sort of its main benefits is, and its main power is sort of setting the standards. It is sort of its independence and its reputation gives it the strength and power to set standards for elections across the European continent, because states refer to its code on good practices on elections, on political parties regulation, financing elections, etc. This influence of the Commission is because of the Commission's reputation of competence and usefulness, its ability to prepare sort of these tailor-made opinions which take into consideration the legal and cultural context of the state which asks for these opinions, and its sort of capacity to build relationships with the states it creates these opinions for. So in a sense, its work is non-imperative and it's dialogical, which means that they enter from sort of the outside as experts together with internal political dynamics to influence possible election reforms. If we see sort of its track record, a brief overview, I do not, it's not a comprehensive overview, but if you look at sort of a brief overview of how states have followed up on the recommendations of the Venice Commission, we can see that they can either accept the recommendations of the Venice Commission, so they can completely implement them, or they can choose not to implement, so they would pass the law as is without any intervention based on the recommendations of the Commission, or in some cases they go contrary to the recommendations of the Commission. Now here, it would be fruitful to analyze sort of the level of democracy that we have in those states which follow the recommendations versus those that don't. But ultimately, the power of the Venice Commission is vested in its reputation and the adherence and the adherence and commitments of states to the development of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Following the Venice Commission, we have the European Court of Human Rights, which is the adjudicative judicial body of sort of the Council of Europe, and its main sort of course, purpose is to adjudicate on the European Convention on Human Rights. And here, instead of following the same pattern as we did with the Venice Commission, I decided to analyze what are sort of the limits of the European Court of Human Rights' jurisprudence on this. So one limit is, of course, its human rights-based approach. Sort of the main target here is Article 3 of Protocol 1, the right to free elections. And sort of a good case study for this are the cases related to Bosnia and Herzegovina, namely Sejdić, Pilov, and more recently Kovačević v. Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the court found violations of Article 3 of Protocol 1 in conjunction with Article 14 of the Convention, where it found that certain aspects of Bosnia and Herzegovina's election system is out of sync, violates sort of the convention. And here it's important to realize that if Bosnia and Herzegovina were to implement these decisions as is required by Article 46 of the convention, then it would require sort of dismantling the entire constitutional structure of Bosnia, as was agreed during the Dayton Agreement. And here is sort of the limit of these legally bound institutions and of course limits of external institutions, especially international organizations and bodies, to influence electoral reform, because ultimately there needs to be a willingness internally to proceed with these reforms. If we continue on with the European Union, this is a very I think interesting aspect, and one which I sort of explored for another topic, minority rights, during my LLM thesis. And I think the same could be followed here. Of course, there's a lot of literature of how the European Union, through its enlargement process and conditionality, which links progress towards European integration and accession with reforms and fulfillment of conditions in policy areas. And here there's and of course the main aspect here, especially for candidate countries currently, is of course the Copenhagen criteria and the European acquis, which is the body of law of the European Union. And here I think what I found with regards to minority rights, and I think it also applies to election standards, the European Union sort of lacks an acquis for national electoral systems. It does have its own electoral system for, of course, the European Parliament, but sort of beyond, again, a human rights approach within the Charter of Fundamental Rights, it doesn't necessarily, I think, have standards for national electoral systems. But here, the European Union, as with other cases where it lacks an internal acquis, proceeds with sort of standard borrowing. So it borrows standards from other institutions like the OSCE, like the Council of Europe, and puts those as sort of conditions for states to progress in its EU accession process. And I think here I think that this could be a good case study for any states, especially sort of the 2004 enlargement and beyond, and even today, especially now with that the European Union and global standards are higher than ever before. at least normatively. And I think it can sort of increase sort of this democratic consolidation that is supposed to happen. And sort of to conclude, because I think I'm slowly running out of time. Again, sort of these external influences are cannot be imposed. Of course, we sort of lawyers, especially, need to define these standards and norms clearly and precisely. And of course, there are institutions and bodies through which these can be promulgated and presented before states. But of course, here there is a necessity to bring states in compliance with international law. And the clearer the norms and standards are, I think we can see a better compliance of states. And of course, external influences by themselves cannot push for any type of reform in this case. So again, it's a balance between national sovereignty and international democratic standards. So how far are states willing to adhere to international norms and standards if they consider themselves to be democratic and hold elections? So I think I'll stop here and we'll continue on in the Q&A.
That's great. Thank you so much. A great presentation and spot on for timing as well. And it does really bring into focus, doesn't it, that important issue that when we think about electoral reform, we assume it's closed systems within national countries, but actually often there are lots of actors involved overseas, and that can bring about lots of questions about legitimacy and illegitimacy and so on as well. So thank you for your presentation, which is much appreciated. So we now move to the fourth and final presentation for the panel, and we have here Rona and Caritos from the Legal Network for Truthful Elections, based in the Philippines, who will be talking about beyond election monitoring, advancing electoral reforms in the Philippines through development entrepreneurship. So hopefully Rona is in the room.
Hello.
Hi. Do you have slides you wish to share?
Yes, I will share a presentation. First, I would like to thank EAP and WFT for giving us this opportunity to share our work in the Philippines. And I will share my presentation now.
Brilliant. Thank you. You're very welcome.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Okay,
welcome to the dog as well.
Yes. All right. Again, the title of my presentation is Beyond Election Monitoring, Advancing Electoral Reforms in the Philippines Through Development Entrepreneurship. So I'm from LENTE. It stands for Legal Network for Truthful Elections. And development entrepreneurship is basically the framework that we use in pursuing electoral reforms in the Philippines. Just to give a bit of a background about our country, the Philippines. Maybe some of you know the man in this picture. He's our most famous expert in the Philippines. He's Manny Pacquiao, I think one of the top 10 greatest boxers in boxing history. So I think that's one information that most of you know about the Philippines. But the Philippines, we have a presidential form of government. Our government has 3 branches. We have our legislative branch, our executive branch, and the judicial branch of government. So the one who makes laws in the Philippines is the legislative branch. And we also have 3 constitutional commissions. And one of our independent constitutional commission is our election management body. Its name is COMELEC, or Commission on Elections. The Philippines also has 1 autonomous region. It's in BARM. It's a Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. And this autonomous region has a parliamentary system of government. So just to give a bit of a background about LENTE, we are an election monitoring organization, but we like to say that we are also an electoral reformer. So we do purposive and systematic monitoring to lobby for electoral reforms and policy reforms. And what we do, we conduct capacity development and political education activities. We collaborate and network with non-partisan like-minded organizations and individuals. LENTE is a legal organization, so we are not a big organization, so we try to amplify our efforts through partnerships with with essentially the same non-partisan neutral organizations and parties in the interest. We also conduct purposive and systematic monitoring of the entire electoral cycle. So LENTE is not only present during election day, but we monitor all stages of the electoral cycle with the end in mind of pursuing electoral reform. So all the data that we get from our monitoring, from our monitors, we use it for our electoral reform to pursue electoral reform before our parliament or before our election management body. So just to give you a bit of a story about LENTE, electoral reform before us, and I'm that person in the picture. I will say that I'm listening in the hearing, although I'm looking at my cell phone, but I'm listening. I'm taking down notes. So electoral reform before for us in LENTE is we just attend parliamentary hearings. We issue statements regarding electoral issues. So that's a traditional election monitoring organization. That's usually how election monitoring organizations operate to pursue electoral reform. But for us now, electoral reform is like this. It's never-ending focus group discussions, small group discussions, and meeting with stakeholders. Like the picture at the left of the slide, that's one member of the parliament in the Bangsamoro region. We were pursuing a draft Bangsamoro electoral code because it's a new system of government. So it has a separate electoral code. So we were talking to members of the parliament, lobbying and hopefully trying to convince them to adopt the whole draft Bangsamoro electoral code or adopt some of the provisions that we are pushing for the Bangsamoro electoral code. We also provide technical assistance to lawmakers, policymakers, and we also lobby, not only with our parliament, but also with our election management body. The picture at the center of the slide, that's me, I think 8-10 years ago, based on the body composition. That's me working on the sideline in our parliament at the House of Representatives, talking to one of the member of our Congress, talking to one of our champions or allies in Congress. We were strategizing on how to move forward with one of the reforms that we were pushing at our parliament and to, skip one of the opponents, the electoral reform that we were pursuing. The two pictures at the bottom of the picture, at the center portion of the slide, those are pictures. Those are just recent pictures of our meetings with our election management body. So we work closely. We coordinate closely with our election management body to also pursue reforms at their level. Because just to give a bit of context, in the Philippines, it's hard to really pursue electoral reforms before the parliament, changes in election laws. Because, for example, for the past 9 years, if we take a look at the performance of our parliament when it comes to passage of election laws, they've only managed to pass 2 laws on elections, 9 years. Managed 2 election laws. One law is on postponement of our village election and postponement of the BARM elections. Another law is a law that benefits them, basically increasing the discount for the campaign propaganda of candidates during the campaign period. So that's the background. That's why aside from pursuing electoral reform with our parliament, we also work directly with our election management body to also pursue electoral reform at their level. Aside from technical assistance, the never-ending focus group discussions and small group discussions, of course, we attend hearings at the parliament. Our parliament composed of the lower house and the upper house. So all the hearings, electoral hearings, we attend, and we also issue statements as part of our advocacy effort in pursuing electoral reform. So what is our framework in pursuing electoral reform? And I mentioned this earlier at the start of my presentation. It's basically the framework on development entrepreneurship. And this is our formula for reform. So we combine technically sound proposals with the political feasibility of such proposals. And how do we define or how do we evaluate if a reform is technically sound? So a reform should be transformative. So basically, it should have a change in existing laws, or it should have a change in existing programs or policies of our election management body. Next criteria is it should be institutionalized. So we don't care much about reforms that would just be piecemeal reforms. So we want reforms to be implemented as much as possible for the whole country, or at least, for example, in our BORM work, for the whole region. And next is scale. It's basically talking about where would the reform be implemented. So that's how we define technically sound reforms. Political feasibility, it's another animal, because when we talk about political feasibility, sometimes our Congress has a 3-year lifetime, a 3-year life, or a 3-year period. So sometimes our Congress is not that interested in pursuing electoral reform. So we take advantage of other opportunities or other avenues to pursue electoral reform. But what we always say, whenever it's not politically feasible when it comes to pursuing our electoral reforms, we always say that maybe this is not the best time, but maybe there will be a better time to pursue such reform. And some of the learnings that we've managed to realize and recognize through the years of adopting this framework of development entrepreneurship, as much as we would like to change the world, electoral reformers need to strategize and really select reform goals to pursue, because you really can change laws, big laws overnight. You need to strategize. You need to choose which are the reforms which are technically sound, but at the same time politically feasible. And we also learned that electoral reform is not simple science, it's complex science. So we always change our methodology, or we always adjust our methodology, the way that we pursue electoral reform, by basically learning by doing. And it's also important to have a multi-sectoral collaboration. And this is me talking from the perspective of a civil society organization. In the Philippines, CSOs or civil society organizations are not that fond or friendly to working with the government, because they feel that working with the government makes their work dirty. But we realize and recognize in LENTE that pursuing electoral reform, there's no other way to pursue electoral reform but basically to work with the government, work with your parliament, or work with the election management body. And last learning that we've managed to get through the years of pursuing electoral reform, public awareness and advocacy is also an important facet of pursuing electoral reform, because just like what I mentioned earlier, some members of parliament are not that informed on the electoral reforms that are needed to make elections better in the country. So it's really important to have that component of public awareness and advocacy in pursuing electoral reform. And this development entrepreneurship, we got this framework from the Asia Foundation, from its program of Coalitions for Change. And what do I mean, and let me expound on what we mean in LENTE by learning by doing. So let me talk about one passage of an election law in the Philippines, which LENTE is a big part of. So this was passed 2016, or the Election Service Reform Act. We started working on this reform 2013, and what we did was to first establish the data to substantiate the provisions that we will use in our draft bill of the Election Service Reform Act. So what we did is to test reform strategies at small scale level. So we just piloted a survey in our village elections. We gathered data, and after gathering data, through the numerous focus group discussions and small group discussions, we're able to refine the draft Election Service Reform Act bill. And at the same time, while having this focus group and discussions, we're also busy building the multi-stakeholder coalition of groups of teachers, election monitors, and legislators that would help us push for the passage of the Election Service Reform Act. And thankfully, after 3 years of working for the passage of this bill, it became law 3 years after, and its impact is it allowed public school teachers in the Philippines to opt out of election duty. It expanded basically the pool of election workers in the Philippines, increased honorariums, and added incentives for teachers. and other citizens in the Philippines to serve. I will end with the slide because I think my time is up, but just to give an example of a reform that we were able to successfully pursue with our election management body is our accessibility work for indigenous peoples or minorities in the Philippines. We've been working for increasing accessibility of elections for indigenous peoples or minorities in the Philippines since 2010. So we've been working for the sector for almost a decade, and we got tired of doing the same thing every 3 years. The structure of our EMB is there will be a commissioner in charge for each vulnerable sector. And the indigenous people or the minorities in the Philippines are classified as part of vulnerable sectors. So we got tired of basically doing the same work every 3 years. So what we did was to copy a model that would institutionalize the work of the COMELEC when it comes to vulnerable sectors. And this model was we copied from the creation of an office specifically created to focus on the concerns of overseas voters in the Philippines or outside of the Philippines. So we pushed for the creation of a vulnerable sector office in our election management body to focus on the vulnerable sectors. And thankfully, because of our almost decade worth of experience working with COMELEC and vulnerable sector organizations and groups in the Philippines, we managed to convince, again, with our election management body, together with our partners from the vulnerable sector groups, for COMELEC to create this vulnerable sector office. And this creation of this vulnerable sector office is through a COMELEC, a Commission on Election Resolution. And up to now, this VSO has been is existing and really doing accessibility work for the commission. So that's how we do electoral reform in the Philippines. We use development entrepreneurship, and we pursue practical, technically sound reforms, and we take advantage of the political situation with our Congress, with our Parliament, or with our election management body, because we know that it's not every day that our Parliament or election management body would consider recommendations or suggestions coming from civil society. So we take advantage of those opportunities. We are ready with the technical data that's needed if ever that timing would be the right time to push for the electoral reform. So that's it. I'm sorry I'm not able to finish my presentation, but you have a copy of my paper, the paper of LENTE, uploaded in the website. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Rona. It was great, such a great presentation, and congratulations on all the excellent work that you guys have done over there. And I really enjoyed the Venn diagram of just showing the overlap between technical feasibility and political feasibility. I think that speaks as a challenge for so many people in so many countries around the world.